Welcome to the conference on Post-Pandemic Future of Homeschooling. I'm the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University. I am Paul Peterson. Our program is referred to as PEPG, so I'm the PEPG director. Thank you all for joining us, and you can see that we've got a great panel, which we will introduce in a minute. And we're just thrilled that there are so many of you. I think it's close to 1,500 who have registered, and most of you are with us here. We've got people from Australia, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, France, Japan, Poland, Germany, Canada, Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and the United Kingdom, plus, of course, the United States. So thank you all, wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. Thank you all for joining us. So the turnout today reflects the massive increase in parental willingness to consider homeschooling for the education of their children at a time when many schools around the world have closed their doors and only offered virtual instruction over the internet. In the United States, the number of children attending homeschool appears to have doubled over the past year. According to the US Census Bureau, interest in homeschooling jumped from little more than 3% a couple years ago to 6% when schools closed last spring, and to 11% this past October. Our own PEPG survey, published in the Education Next journal, finds homeschooling to have doubled from 3% to 6%. Now, the exact percentages depend on the way you ask the question, but all indications suggest that homeschooling is on the rise, and a very rapid rise, at least for now. Parents are teaching themselves with the help of tutors, with neighborhood pods, and with the help of online services. Homeschooling, nonetheless, remains controversial. Some think that the very best schooling occurs at home, while others think it is the worst form of education. The opinions of the vast majority fall somewhere in between. We plan to delve into these issues over the next 7 weeks, each Thursday at this time. If you miss a session, you can catch up by viewing a recording of the session on PEPG's website. It will be posted as soon as possible, but it takes us a little time because we're going to close caption for those who are disabled. So I wish to recognize Antonio Wentland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor, the staff here at PEPG, who have done so much to make the conference possible. And now I would like to introduce Daniel Hamlin, a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. Daniel Hamlin has done the heavy lifting in the preparation for this conference. He's an expert on the topic. He's published in some of the highest quality, most objective empirical research on the topic. And Daniel and I are going to be sharing the responsibilities for moderating today's webinar, as well as those in the coming weeks. So Daniel, I now turn the floor over to you.
Well, Paul, thank you for that introduction. I'll just say very briefly, I'm very excited about the scholars, the policy experts, and parents who have agreed to participate in this 7-part series. And so, having said that, I'm going to quickly turn now to today's expert panel, who will be discussing our session question: is it time for a change to homeschool law? So first, we have Elizabeth Bartholet joining us, and she is professor at Harvard Law School and faculty director of Harvard Law School's Child Advocacy Program. And she's also written extensively on homeschool law and regulation. Next, we have senior counsel for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, Mike Donnelly. He's also director of global outreach for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and he teaches constitutional law at Patrick Henry College. Our third panelist is Eric Werin. He is a professor of education statistics at Kennesaw State University. His research is focused on the idea of hybrid homeschooling, and he's recently published a book on that topic that's titled Little Platoons: Defining Hybrid Homeschools in America. Finally, we have James Dwyer. He's a professor of law at William and Mary College. He has also recently published a book on homeschooling, and it's titled Homeschooling: The History and Philosophy of a Controversial Practice. So for our discussion today on whether it's time for a change to homeschool law, we'll go in the order of the program, starting with Dr. Bartholet, And each panelist will have 5 minutes to make their initial remarks on the session question. And then we'll move to take questions from for the panelists from the audience. And so we kindly ask the panelists to keep their responses to the audience questions to about 1 minute. And just as a quick note to the audience, we certainly want to hear from you, and we encourage you to post your questions to the panelists using the Q&A chat function in Zoom. So with that, Dr. Bartholet, I will turn it over to you.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Was muted. Okay, I'll start again. Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul and Daniel, for organizing this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of your series. So the question you've asked us to address, time for a change to homeschooling law. Is it time for a change to homeschooling law? And my answer is a resounding yes. My position is grounded in some very traditional ideas. Namely, that children and society have strong interests in both education and in protection of children against abuse and neglect. I'll note in that connection that every state constitution in the United States provides a robust right to education, and also every state has very powerful laws protecting children against abuse and neglect. So today's homeschool regime provides no guarantee of these fundamental rights. And I will note, without going into the international picture, but I will note that there's a very significant contrast between the absence of effective regulation in the United States and the nature of regulation to the degree homeschooling is allowed throughout the world. There are, of course, countries that don't allow it at all, but where it is allowed, almost always there's significant regulation protecting children's right to education. So I want to acknowledge first that I believe it's true, as many assert, that many homeschooling parents are providing terrific educations for their children, and that relatively few are guilty of abuse and neglect. My concern is with the subset of homeschooled children, and we don't know the size of the homeschooled, of the subset I'm concerned with, in part because there's such an extreme absence of effective regulation. But my concern is with what I believe to be a significant subset that aren't getting any meaningful education and that are suffering from abuse and neglect. Certainly all homeschooling children are at risk of abuse and neglect because of the absence of regulation. So I think we need a homeschooling regime that protects the subset. And I'll just point out that most regulation is designed to protect subsets. So the very fact that we have regulation with respect to abuse and neglect in this country, it's not because most parents are guilty of abuse and neglect, it's because a subset are, and our laws are designed to protect the vulnerable subset. So I think we need a homeschooling regime that protects the subset. We need to make the on paper powerful rights to education and to protection against abuse and neglect real for homeschooled children. This means for me two basic forms of regulation, one related to education. I think we have to regulate to ensure that children are getting the basics of an adequate education. This means to me, first, we have to ensure that parents are capable and committed to providing a broad education. Secondly, we have to test students objectively to ensure they're learning. And third, we have to guarantee, and this is more controversial, but I believe we need to guarantee that all students, even if we're allowing the parents to homeschool, attend some courses and extracurricular activities at school. I think children need access to and exposure to the larger society outside of their family and their parents' particular culture. I think this exposure is essential to realize what's often been called the child's right to an open future, by which is meant the right of children to exercise autonomy in their future adult lives, to exercise some choice as to their own lifestyle, and some ability to exit their parents' chosen culture and lifestyle if the adult children so choose. So the second form of regulation I think is essential is to protect against abuse and neglect. I think we need to screen all prospective homeschooling parents for whether they have a significant history of abuse and neglect of children, and probably for other, criminal conduct related to the abuse of children. And I think we need to ensure that all homeschool children are viewed on a regular basis, not just a once a year basis, by mandated reporters, because the teachers that are mandated reporters of suspected child abuse are perhaps the greatest protectors we have in our society of children against abuse and neglect. They're the largest group of mandated reporters for child protective services. So I'll just conclude by saying that today's homeschooling regime, while there are some laws on the books, basically provides, and I think the research demonstrates this, no effective regulation whatsoever guaranteeing any of the above fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, you're up next. Mike Donnelly, I think you're up next. You're muted.
Thanks, Dan. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen to share. Give me a moment here, and I will do so. Are you seeing the main slide there?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the delay. It's really a privilege to be with this group, and I want to thank the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm excited about what you're doing to support and encourage more empirical research on homeschooling. And as a homeschooling parent myself, 7 children, I know I speak for millions of others that my motivation to homeschool is driven by my desire for my children to learn in a safe, nurturing, and loving environment where they have the maximum opportunity to learn and to grow into literate, mature, self-confident members of society. And this is what we see from the new parents who've been practically thrown into homeschooling by the pandemic, who've selected homeschooling as what they see as the safest and most stable learning environment for their children during a time of great concern and uncertainty. And as Dr. Peterson pointed out, homeschooling has certainly grown, with the Census Bureau indicating a doubling of it from 5 to 12%. It is interesting to note that the most significant areas of growth that have been seen by the reports of the Census Bureau is among minority groups, Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities. And the question we're discussing today, should homeschool laws be changed? Well, as this slide shows, homeschool laws have changed quite a bit over the decades as legislative, executive, and judicial action have recognized homeschooling over the past 60 to 70 years. This year, South Dakota, actually, and West Virginia, among other states, have changed their laws in what's been a 20-year-long trend of states changing their laws to make homeschooling more accessible, to provide more opportunities for homeschooled students, and to prohibit unfair treatment of homeschooled students. Of course, as our founder, Ben Franklin, stated famously, we live in a republic, which means that education law is the subject of state law, not a matter delegated to the federal government. However, the United States Supreme Court has issued important decisions I want to bring to your attention relevant to the role of government in family decision-making, including education. For example, in 1920, the Supreme Court said in Pierce v. Society of Sisters that the child is not the mere creature of the state, that those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. In 1972, in Wisconsin versus Yoder, the court wrote that the primary role of parents in upbringing of their children is now established beyond debate as an enduring American tradition. There's a presumption, the court wrote in Parham v. JR in 1979, that fit parents act in the best interest of their children. And in 2000, in Troxel v. Granville, the court wrote, there's normally no reason for the state to inject itself into the private realm of the family to further question fit parents' ability to make the best decisions regarding their children. We see this echoed also in international human rights norms. And why is that important? Well, it's important because history has shown us what can happen when governments take total control and ban or severely restrict the ability of parents to choose a private education. You can look at Cuba or China today or the former Soviet Union. In Germany, we saw what happened when the government schools were taken over and advanced National Socialism. In fact, it was out of the horrors of World War II that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was inspired. And it was in response to Germany's use of schools and weaponization of schools that Article 26.3 was written to state that parents have a prior right to decide how children are educated. Numerous other treaties also recognize these important rights. No right is absolute, of course, and there is an important role for government in protecting children from known harm. Sadly, there are criminals who abuse children, even their own. However, unnecessary government intervention in families can also be harmful to children. And our constitutional framework also demands due process to protect all of these important interests and does not permit a presumption of suspicion or guilt. There's a lot of evidence that homeschooling is effective and good for children, and there's little or no evidence that suggests that homeschooled children are at higher risk of abuse or neglect from their parents. But we do know that as many as 10% of children enrolled in schools are abused or neglected by school personnel, in spite of the presence of teachers who are, as Dr. Bartholet noted, mandatory reporters. The idea that we'd impose wide-ranging intrusions on a particular category of innocent people because of a minuscule number of bad actors is contrary to American notions of policymaking and due process. In practice, we also see that homeschooling works and that it is safe. Empirical research indicates homeschooled children do well academically, have access to cultural capital, are politically tolerant. There's no statistically significant connection between abuse and homeschooling. That homeschooled graduates in surveys have said that they're satisfied with their homeschooling in large numbers. They're civically engaged in society and literate, productive citizens. So in conclusion, decades of policy research, policy debate and research shows that less regulation makes homeschooling more accessible to a wide diversity of people. So the current trajectory of regulatory reforms is appropriate in keeping with these constitutional presumptions, research, and observed practice. It's not an obstacle to protecting our precious children, and it's a way for us, for some parents who choose it, to provide opportunities to experience an education that treats them as the unique persons that they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Let me stop my
Daniel?
screen share.
Okay,
Thank you.
Eric, you're up next.
All right, well, thank you so much. So does the law regarding homeschooling need to be revised? I do work with hybrid homeschools. If you have not heard of these, you can think of them as basically more formal versions of homeschool co-ops. Kids typically attend physical schools with teachers, desks, uniforms 2 or 3 days a week, and are at home asynchronously working on lessons or doing enrichment led by their parents on the other days. This is a very different thing from what a lot of schools called hybrid learning this past year. So those schools are an example of how the educational landscape is fracturing. Americans like individualized solutions to everything, right? People like Netflix suggestions. People like Amazon suggestions. And many people are turning to some version of homeschooling to provide that kind of individualized attention. And we're doing so before the virus. So when we think about then how to regulate homeschooling, I want to touch on 3 reasons people might want to do that: socialization reasons, academic reasons, and then physical safety reasons. And then at the end of my time, I'll say a little bit about how homeschool laws can and have affected these hybrid schools. So first, socialization, right? Or the idea that people need to be looking in on homeschoolers in order to ensure that they're getting social skills and are being prepared for democratic society. I find this argument pretty unpersuasive. One could argue that kids spend most of their time at home, and so it's good for them to be exposed to other viewpoints in a school setting because they'll hear the conservative side or the religious side of things at home. But what if, imagine a family that's already completely aligned with a progressive left-leaning social culture at a school. If we care about diversity, is it not important for those kids to be exposed to conservative or religious ideas, since those values are represented in about half of the country too? If the answer is yes, then I'm not sure why we're focused on regulating homeschooling versus some bigger viewpoint diversity project, right? If the answer is no, then that is a tell that we really are talking about indoctrination from one side only. Second reason, which I find a little bit more persuasive, is academic, right? In other words, the argument that kids have a right to get some kind of basic education and should not just be kept at home and taught nothing for 18 years. Getting at a fair solution to that is tricky, and I think it's rare anyway, not to mention that plenty of conventional 5-day schools would also fail that test. Homeschoolers typically have some legitimate grievances with the content and methods taught in the schools available to them, or they're just playing a different game entirely, right? They care more about family time together or practical skills rather than some sort of narrow college preparation. There may be some kind of fair assessment arrangement we could come up with. I don't have a proposal today, but annual testing is certainly too intrusive and won't really capture what kids are learning at home. And then the third reason, which I have the most sympathy for, is using regulation to protect kids' physical safety, especially in isolated places. Although I'm still not convinced homeschoolers pose a unique problem there compared to conventional schools. But still, maybe there's something we can do to protect those kids, that subset of kids. I think something like regular home visits would be much too intrusive and inappropriate. I've heard the suggestion that maybe homeschool parents get something like 2 non-related mandatory reporters, like a pediatrician, to sign off annually that they've seen a kid and that he seems okay. That seems to me to be a reasonable place, at least to start a conversation. And so I'll end with 2 stories about hybrid homeschools and how homeschool laws can affect them. So first, a few years ago, I visited 2 hybrid homeschools that are physically pretty close to each other. I think they're in different counties, but they're only a few miles apart. They both operate on the surface the same way: 2 days in class, 3 days at home. They both hire teachers, have buildings, wear uniforms. The school decides the curriculum. And I asked both principals, do you and your families consider yourselves to be homeschoolers or members of a private school? At school A, the principal said, oh, we definitely think of ourselves as homeschoolers who get a little bit of support from the school. At school B, you can probably see where this is going. The principal told me, no, we reject the homeschool label. We think of ourselves as a college prep private school that our families support at home. School A has their kids register with the state as homeschoolers. School B counts their kids as attending a private school, even though operationally they look just about the same. So there's probably a legally correct answer there, but both of those schools are just kind of doing what they want based on their families' cultures. To me, that's a feature, not a bug, right? They both told me that the state regulators just aren't sure how to look at them. I'll save the story for time reasons. Maybe someone can ask me in the Q&A about that. But we had an issue here in Georgia a few years ago over homeschoolers and a state college scholarship law that sort of unintentionally swept up the hybrid schools. But just to close, I think that as these hybrid schools grow in number and as things like education savings accounts enable more kids to have really varied experiences where they're learning in multiple places over the course of a week, we'll see more kids who are sort of formally tagged as homeschoolers, but who don't look much like anyone's traditional view of homeschoolers. So instead of creating kind of blanket restrictions or trying to play whack-a-mole with every new variation that comes up, we'd be better off acknowledging that people want different things, even things that we might consider to be weird. And so doing too much through regulation to clamp down on homeschooling in the name of certain particular ideas of socialization or in the name of kind of a constrained view of academic outcomes stands a very good chance of stamping out some interesting innovations and hurting some kids unintentionally. So thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you. Daniel.
I'm muted. Okay, now we have James.
Thank you. I want just to make a couple of conceptual points and a few factual observations. So first, I like the way you framed the question, should the law be changed? Many people frame the question instead as, should there be more regulation or more state intervention? But that's actually a nonsensical way to look at the situation. That perspective wrongly equates complete parental control with non-regulation and non-state intervention. In reality, when people say that parents are entitled to more legal power over their children, they are simply demanding one form of state intervention into children's lives rather than another. So they are asserting that the government owes a duty to parents to inject itself into their children's lives in a particular way. That is by giving certain other private parties, the parents, legal power to control their lives, power that state institutions enforce, right? Police ensuring no one else takes a child away or instructs the child without parental permission. Courts ordering private and public agencies also to stay away. So if someone asked the state to give them legal power over your life, you would readily see that as state intervention into your life, right? In a profound way. So the parental empowerment position is by no means a libertarian stance as it's often portrayed. It's not actually a demand that the state stay out of children's lives or out of family life. And it's not a negative right that's being claimed for parents, but rather a positive right. It's a contention that parents are morally entitled to the state's giving them something to satisfy their desire to dictate the course of their child's life. It's a demand for assistance from the state in doing that to the exclusion of others. My second conceptual point is that every child in this country receives home instruction and always has, not just during a pandemic, right? And no one, as far as I know, has ever proposed subjecting all or even most home instruction to state prescription or oversight. So even if a child attends regular school, they are under parental control the vast majority of the time that they are awake. And during that time, parents can and do instruct their children. So the school year is 180 days per year, right? And there are more than twice that number of days in a year. A typical school day is 7 hours. A typical child is awake twice that number of hours each day. So even a child who attends a regular school is away from their parents only a fourth of their awake time, leaving parents 3/4 of a child's total time awake each year to teach them whatever the parents want to teach them. So over 13 years, K to 12, that's about 50,000 hours parents would still have even if children attended a regular school away from the parents. And that's not even counting the preschool years, right? So regardless of any reform proposal that anyone's floating, parents would still have ample opportunity to teach their children whatever they want to teach them. So the real question is whether any child's learning should be entirely home-based. And if so, whether some small portion of it should conform to standards that state education officials prescribe. And that might only entail a few hours per school day, right? Given the greater efficiency of homeschooling that its advocates often claim, which I find plausible. So it could be 10 or 15% of the time a child is awake each year that would need to be devoted to knowledge and skills that the state thinks children ought to have. And probably most homeschooling parents are already doing whatever reasonable requirements might entail. Also at issue, of course, assuming homeschooling continues to be permitted, as I think it should be, is whether the child should be guaranteed some interaction with persons outside the family, sufficient to ensure they are progressing academically and socially and are safe and healthy. And that Eric is open to exploring possibilities. And I do think it's important not to stifle the good while trying to prevent the bad. In thinking about those guarantees for a child, which I hope everyone can do with an open mind, here are some facts to consider. 20% of adults in the United States have a mental illness. 10% of adults have a drug abuse problem. 16% of the adult population has an IQ under 85. 10% of adults did not complete high school or a GED program. According to recent surveys, 27% of Americans do not accept that the earth revolves around the sun. 16% of Americans are either uncertain whether the earth is round or firmly believe it is flat. 60% of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. Each year, 3.5 million children in this country have screened-in reports of maltreatment. Over 1,000 children die every year because of parental abuse or neglect. 25% of women have been victims of severe domestic violence, and millions of adults have been convicted of other violent crimes. In short, there is a lot of dysfunction among adults in our society. Probably a fourth of all adults would be rejected for adoption of a child, and would be disqualified from any job working with children. There is some reason to believe those phenomena are disproportionately present among parents who do not send their child to a school. For example, the Connecticut study finding that 36% of parents who withdraw a child from school, ostensibly to homeschool, had previous screened-in maltreatment reports. And there's a study showing that the homeschooling rate is highest among adults who never finished high school in different categories of educational achievement. So the state's bestowing on those parents so much legal power over children that they can, if they want to, most don't, but if they want to, completely isolate the children so that no one else lays eyes on the child, perhaps for months or even years, can completely dominate the child's life and development, is, I think, reckless and immoral policy. And I think it's also unconstitutional. The state violates the 14th Amendment rights of children by giving anyone such monopoly control over their life and development, just as it would if it gave anyone such control over your life. A final thought about good faith. So political philosophers speak of the virtue of reasonableness as an essential attribute of a member of a just society. Reasonableness entails open-mindedness, respect for others' views, listening, humility, giving reasons for one's own views that one can expect others to accept. So in our book on homeschooling, my co-author and I endeavored to do that. I reject extremely negative views about homeschooling. I reject the position that it should be banned. I extol its potential virtues, and I urge policymakers not to stifle them. So I think the book presents a quite moderate view and a respectful view. And my hope is that advocates for homeschooling can respond in kind.
All right, thank you all for keeping to your time and allowing us to have an opportunity to have a conversation about these interesting ideas that the four panelists have put forward. Daniel, do you have a question you would like to pose to a panelist? We're going to try to keep everybody's responses to 1 minute so we can explore as many different questions as possible. But why don't you take the lead on the first question?
Sure. I'll try to bundle a couple of questions that were in the chat. And maybe I'll pose this one to Eric, if you don't mind. So what about the argument here that why shouldn't we allow the state to prescribe at least some portion of education? And anyway, most homeschoolers are probably already doing well on what might be prescribed anyway. So what is the harm here?
Well, I might turn that around and say, what's the benefit? Like, why does the state have the kind of the, why do we give the state the ability to reach in and do something that parents have for millennia based on, right? I just don't. I think parents are for the vast majority of them are well-intentioned. Homeschooling is not easy, and so it's a minuscule percentage who would take on the loss of income, the loss of time. I have 7 kids at home, and we hybrid homeschool. The crazy stress of it for reasons other than positive ones. I think we get the question backwards when we say, why shouldn't we hand our children over to portions of society that we may not agree with and say, please undo what I'm doing at home. And I think that's a backwards way of looking at it.
So I have a question for James. You made some very interesting points about the prevalence of dysfunction in our society. But I also am aware of the fact that for the last 100 years, people have been going to state-operated institutions. They're run by school boards. A very small percentage of the population has been homeschooled over the last 100 years, as far as I know. Now, some people do drop out of school at age 8 or not at age 8, in grade 8, and like my father did. But you know, most people went to a public school controlled by the government. If that's the solution to all these problems that you identify, then why are these problems so prevalent today? Shouldn't we possibly think that maybe if we had more homeschooling, those problems would be lessened?
So I didn't suggest that mandatory public schooling was a solution to anything. That's not my prescription. And I also would say that the dysfunction is not a result, perhaps a few exceptions, of people having attended public schooling, but rather as a result of the parenting that they received as children outside of school.
All right, Daniel, you have another question.
Sure. There are quite a few questions, as you might imagine, on abuse. So there's a bit of a pretty robust debate happening in the chat and in the Q&A right now about abuse in public and private schools. So the argument that's coming up here is that, well, the abuse is higher in public and private. I'm reporting back on some of the comments here, is that the abuse seems to be higher in public and private schools, some are arguing. And so that's sort of the question here. Why are we so worried about homeschooling when all this other stuff is going on in public and private schools? So maybe I'll pose that question to Dr. Bartholet. And you're muted.
As best I know, there's zero evidence that there's more abuse in schools than in homeschooling situations. So I just don't think there's any evidence of that. But, of course, there are problems in public schools with respect to abuse and neglect. It is nonetheless true that if students are in school and they're abused, at least there are, a large number of mandated reporters. Basically, all school personnel, including but not limited to teachers, are going to be required, if they suspect abuse and neglect, including by, at least in some states, it's going to be including by people in school, they have to report it. So it is also true that most murders of children and other severe abuse of children is done by parents, not by strangers. I mean, that's overwhelmingly the case. So, of course, there are problems in public schools. We ought to address them. But at least in school, if a child is abused in school, there are witnesses to it, there are peers. There's some escape and hope for the child, whereas if a child is abused in a completely isolated homeschool situation, there is no hope for that child. The parents are completely free in today's homeschooling regime to keep that child isolated, to torture them to their heart's content, and there's no reason, no requirement that the parents have the child see anybody who could protect or report that child.
Okay, can we take that up then? So Mike, I noticed you put your hand up. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I would, because it's simply not the case that parents are free to abuse or torture their children. There are laws against that, as people pointed out. They're not free to do it, and there's no evidence that it happens in homeschooling environment at any higher rate. And I think if you look at, as I pointed out, schools, it does happen there. So the abuse and neglect system in our country needs some reform. When you look at the number of false positives, 90% of abuse and neglect reports that are investigated are unfounded. The problem we have is a resource misallocation, and there are children who need state intervention because there's evidence of abuse and neglect. And so there is some need for reform in that area, but there's no reason to think we should impose additional regulations on homeschoolers because a few people may abuse their children. It's interesting when we're talking about this issue because we see a real clash of worldviews here. I just want to, if I could take one moment to address Professor Dwyer's point, which in his interesting book, he makes the point that the state kind of precedes the parent. And I think that's something we should talk a little bit more about.
Okay, so I actually think that's a good point because, there is the liberal tradition that goes back to Hobbes and to Locke, which really sort of says that, the the society exists and gives its a consent to government by the state. So, and I do see a difference of opinion as to who has, you know, are parents given the right to take care of their children, or do parents inherently have that right independent of government? And so I would like, who would like to respond? I think there's probably a range of points of view on here, and we've heard James make his case. How about Elizabeth? Do you want to make your discussion, and we'll come back to?
Yes, thank you. I want to make just a quick response to Mike Donnelly's point that he claims parents aren't free to abuse and neglect their children because there are laws against it. Yes, there are laws against it. Nonetheless, parents are completely free to abuse and neglect their children if they keep them at home and don't allow the children to be seen by anyone else. And there is certainly a subset of homeschooling parents that are doing just that. There are homeschooling parents that withdraw their children from school because the children are reported for abuse and neglect. So it is definitely a factual phenomenon. The fact there are laws that say you can't abuse your children doesn't really matter if there's no effectiveness to those laws.
So, Mike, how do you respond to that?
Well, I want to get back to Professor Dwyer's interesting clash of worldviews, but the reality is that there's plenty of social workers out there who are conducting investigations. One of the things that our association does is we assist homeschooling parents to comply with the law, be informed about the law, and when they encounter conflict with government, whether it's education or child protective services, we assist them and advise them and provide help. And it's true, as Professor Bartholet says, there are cases where children are withdrawn from school because of abuse or neglect. But what you see in these cases, and I've studied this, I've been doing this for 15 years, these are a handful of cases over the course of 15 years. And what you see is that most of the time, the social services agencies knew about these families, and they're the ones who failed to follow their protocols, and they're the ones who did not do their job to protect these children. So if we're talking about how to protect children, I think there's a lot more to talk about in the area of child protective service reform than in trying to impose regulations on homeschooling. I think when you try to put the finger on homeschooling and say, oh, we've got to increase laws here, you're masking a really serious problem. So again, that's not the topic of our discussion here today, but I think that's how I would respond to that.
James, you had your hand up for a little while there.
On this empirical question, we simply don't have the data set to support Mike's position. Child protection agencies don't track how many parents are homeschooling with whom they have substantiated reports of abuse. On the other side, we have this study of people who withdraw their children from school, right, which is not a database that you have, that showed in Connecticut, in 6 school districts, 36% of those parents had a history of child maltreatment. What is the significance of that? I don't see how you can just claim that there are only a few when you have 36% of parents withdrawing in a representative sample with that kind of history.
You're not saying 36% of the parents withdraw their kids from school. You're saying of those who withdraw their kids from school, 36% have it. But what percentage are withdrawing their kids from school, James?
Right, and that's not all homeschoolers, and Mike might have better information about that than others, but we're talking about many hundreds of parents, right, in 6 school districts in Connecticut. So this is not all homeschoolers. Many homeschoolers start homeschooling instead of first sending a child to school. But among those who first send a child to school and then withdraw, in this study, which is the only one I'm aware of, 36% had a history of maltreatment. That seems significant to me.
Eric?
Well, I think if Mike wants to respond directly to that, he can jump in line if he wants to, and then you can come back to me.
I would like to. The Connecticut study is a flawed study. I would encourage people to go to our website at hslda.org. It has problems with sampling. And so I don't want to spend our time debating this study, that study. There are thousands of studies that have looked at homeschooling, and looking at one government person's review of government data with some flaws, I think we should be careful to interpret that too conclusively. But the state versus the parent. Locke versus Rousseau, perhaps. Who gets to decide? I think this is the clash. This is the interesting clash we have here today. Is like, who gets to decide? In our country, for hundreds of years, we've had the presumption that we defer to parents, that parents have the best interests of their children at heart. I mean, when you look at the Declaration of Independence, why are governments instituted among men? To preserve our rights. Our rights don't come from government. We create governments to protect our rights. And so I don't think it's correct to say that our rights come from government, that governments have any particular precedence when it comes to making decisions about children. And they should not, absent reason to believe otherwise, intervene in the family, whether it's on education or healthcare or other reasons.
So I have a question for Eric, which really says, how much do you think that homeschooling is going to be transformed by the access that people have to the internet? Are we seeing a major change away from instruction by parents primarily towards instruction primarily by non-parents, with the parents playing a sort of supplemental role, a tutorial role, the kinds of things that parents do all the time, and as has been pointed out by others, is a part of the tradition of parenting. So is this a changing field or not?
Yeah, and I think this is related to your previous question too. A lot of the people that I work with at these hybrid schools have spent time as full-time homeschoolers, right? If we're at 6% now, we're at a quarter or more of hybrid school parents have spent some time as a full-time homeschooler. And they're sort of voluntarily entering into these smaller communities to kind of have other people help them out with different subjects, or just because they want another community. So they're voluntarily entering into that. So they're okay with that. They're less okay with higher levels, right? The county or the state or the feds kind of pushing down on them. In terms of technology has made a lot of this easier for full-time homeschoolers and for hybrid homeschoolers in terms of materials and curricula. The hybrid schools weathered the pandemic shutdowns really well because they had some practice working online a little bit already. But I think these things are moving together, right? Technology plus everyone's desire for more bespoke solutions to things, plus just the fact that over the past few years, it's become more normal to be a homeschooler. It seems like less of an odd thing to do than it did a few years ago. So I think, I would hate to overstate how far this is going to grow, but I think we are seeing kind of an upward trajectory for these hybrid schools and more full-time homeschoolers.
Elizabeth, you have your hand up.
Thanks. I want to address two of Mike Donnelly's points. So one, he claims that there's this centuries-long tradition in the United States that parents have 100% control and government none with respect to children. That's just flat out wrong. The tradition for a couple of centuries has been shared responsibility for children between parents and government. And it's been seen as amazing forward progress that government has, for example, outlawed child labor, even if parents want to put their kids to labor, and guaranteed education and guaranteed protections against abuse and neglect. Secondly, Mike Donnelly keeps citing the research that HSLDA regularly relies on. And I just want to say that there's an international group of respectable, highly reputed indeed, social scientists who formed an international organization on homeschooling research, specifically because of the junk science that HSLDA and other homeschooling movement advocates constantly cite. So that has been recognized as not good science, and there's a lot of, respectable science out there, and it does not support the kind of positions that HSLDA and Mike Donnelly here are claiming.
So,
If I may,
curiosity of
I think
mine
if you don't mind, I'd just like to address that. I find that to be rather insulting and offensive. And I don't think that kind of language is necessary in this debate. I wasn't citing HSLDA research. HSLDA doesn't publish a lot of research. I've published some research that has appeared in peer-reviewed journals, and I'm referring to the thousands of articles which are cataloged on the ICHER website, which I know the website, I know the organization does good work in cataloging homeschool research, and there is a lot of empirical and peer-reviewed research on homeschooling, and that's the research that I'm talking about when I refer to research. We have been involved in supporting some surveys. I did refer to some of those surveys in my opening remarks, and those surveys stand for themselves. They're good samples. They represent generally on the homeschooling community. And so, yeah, I mean, we're not talking about junk science here, Professor Bartholet. We're talking about real science.
But there is this issue that really needs to be addressed. Are the people teaching their kids at home things that are untrue? And it's not that maybe the abuse problem can be handled through a more general agencies that address that problem more broadly, as you're suggesting. But is it the case that really a lot of homeschooling is teaching bad science, and that the reason we have to have kids in school is to have them more instructed properly, that the education they're getting is the wrong education?
It looks like James has his hand up. James?
Yeah, so I'll address that point. I'm less preoccupied with content than a lot of people are. If children don't learn X, Y, or Z that's in the state's curriculum, that's probably irrelevant. What's important is developing certain skills, scientific methods, critical thinking, creativity, right? And I certainly would not say that a lot of homeschoolers are failing to provide this. I don't know the number. I don't think anybody really knows the number. And the question is just, should we ensure that no one is getting so deficient in education that they're not developing those skills and some basic knowledge?
So is anybody concerned about this? Michael, do you feel this is a potential problem?
That homeschool parents are teaching their children wrong things? I don't think it's a problem. No, I think, again, real research can be found that talks about how homeschool children perform on academic assessments, standardized tests, SAT, ACT scores. So they're doing well, at least as well as or better than their public and private school counterparts. That, you go find the research, it's out there. It's not my interpretation, it's the fact. And so I don't think we have a problem that homeschool children are being taught wrong things. They're doing well, they're moving into society, they're going in the military, they're getting jobs, they're going to college, they do well in college. So I think I agree with Professor Dwyer about the content. I think that's happening. We would like to see increasing change in laws to recognize homeschooling, to respect homeschooled students, to make sure that they have equal opportunities to advance in society. And that's what we've been advocating for decades, and will continue to do so.
Can I just tag on? I think my hand is not going up on Zoom, so I'll just butt in. Just to turn, the easy thing is just to turn that around and say, are kids in every other school being taught bad things or incorrect things too, right? I think one knock that often occurs against homeschool kids is that when you measure it, they maybe don't always go to as elite colleges as other kids do, but a lot of times they're avoiding places like, we'll say, Yale, rather than going to the most elite places they can, because they want to stay wherever they are. So they're intentionally choosing, Newman Guide schools or something else like that on purpose. So I think we should be careful about measuring them by sticks that they are intentionally rejecting.
Elizabeth?
So I think the problem with the research that Mike Donnelly is citing here is that, yes, it's true, there are some research studies that look at the children and youth that actually take standardized, SAT type tests and go to college, and how do they do? And that research shows they do okay, but they have some problems, but I won't get into that. They do okay academically, but the real problem is we don't have research on the students that don't or the youth that don't graduate high school, don't go to college. We don't have research on what's happening with those children in terms of their academic or life or employment or other outcomes.
Well, I think you're right, Elizabeth, that a lot of the data on homeschooling requires participation, which is voluntary, and we don't have as, we don't necessarily capture the totality of all children, that we don't have a representative sample of all children. It's very difficult to do that. This is a problem when you're doing this kind of research, but how do you deal with that, Michael, that the data sets that you have are necessarily limited to the homeschoolers who are willing to participate in giving you the information about how well their child is doing on tests and in going to college?
Dr. Peterson, that's why I'm so excited about what you're doing with PEPG. There is a need for more empirical research, and I fully support empirical research. I don't have any doubt what that empirical research is going to find. Is there a small subset of children who have problems? Yes, that's true in every segment of society. Are there laws that address those problems? Yes, there are. Do they work? Pretty well. I think we catch most of the problems. Do some slip through the cracks? I'm afraid so. In a free society, you've got to tolerate some of that. And when you find that, you go after it. You punish people who do bad things, and you try to catch it. And there's every reason to believe that those problems are caught. But it's true that research on homeschooling is somewhat self-selective, although I think that's improving. I think that researchers are finding ways to gain access to data sets that is not self-selected. For example, the US Census Bureau has data, NCES has data that is non-self-selective. It's part of the household survey. So there's a lot of non-self-selective data out there, which Dr. Hamlin has done some research on, and others who are going to present later in this series. And it's empirical based. It's not self-selected. So you got to work with what you've got. I would point people to Dr. Lindsay Burke's survey of the literature, Joseph Murphy's book, Vanderbilt Dean on homeschooling in America, which looked at hundreds of articles, many of which are cataloged at the ICHR website, to make these conclusions that homeschooling works, that homeschool kids on average do about as good or better than their private school counterparts. And it's good for kids, good for families, good for communities.
So maybe we should give you all a last minute to make your final observations. Why don't we go in reverse order? James, do you have any final observations to make?
Sure. I would just urge people to be fair on both sides of the empirical research. If you're going to call selection bias on one side, then you ought to do it with other studies as well. And I would also note that there is a kind of non sequitur involved in some of the discussion of the research. If you're going to say, studies show homeschooling is as good as public schooling, then you're implicitly saying public schooling is as good as homeschooling, right? So you're making a concession about the quality of regular schooling as well.
So Eric?
Yeah, and I'll just make the point that homeschooling is growing, but I think everyone should be prepared for it to look a lot stranger in the coming years too. It's going to have a bunch of different varieties that we're not used to, which will complicate the research even more. So that, and then I think it's worth realizing that maybe even most homeschoolers are just playing a different game than what we're typically used to measuring for conventional schools. And I think it's, if we've learned anything in general over the past year, it's that different places have different tastes and different expectations. And I think it would behoove us to be a little more okay with that sort of difference.
So Michael, your last observations.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Peterson and Harvard's Kennedy School for facilitating this very important discussion of some very important ideas. We all care about children. We care about the education of children. We care about our country. I think, as Eric said, one of the great things about our country is there's so much creativity. And as a country, we care about education and our children. That's why this is such an important conversation. The question, do we need changes in laws? Well, there are going to be changes in laws. There have been, there are being changes, and there will be changes. Where do those changes go? Well, we're all going to be involved in that conversation. Another great thing about our country, that we have a great civic debate, and this is evidence of that. So again, thank you, Professor Bartholet, Professor Dyer, Professor Warren, and to PEPG at Harvard for this great conversation, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it.
So thank you. Elizabeth, do you have a final observation? We're going to give you the final word here.
I'll just make a very limited final observation, which has to do with the absence of adequate research today. So that has in significant part to do with the fact that we don't even require in many states that homeschooling parents register that they are homeschooling. So we don't know the population of homeschoolers. If we had even that minimal requirement, we could actually study the level of abuse and neglect. Well, that would still be hard because if it's not seen and reported, you don't know what's happening, but we'd have a prayer at studying that and at studying the educational outcomes of these children.
So I actually find more agreement today than I expected to find. Just as a final word, I find that the entire panel recognizes that homeschooling is part of the American educational process, and it's not going to go away, and it does have a place. Some of you feel that it should be subjected to more regulation. All of you think that at least child abuse in the home should be subject to governmental investigation. Nobody is taking the position that government shouldn't be concerned about the welfare of children within the family, but you just have different approaches going forward. So yes, it's all a matter of degree and balance, but I do see an area of agreement. It's all the more reason for looking at the kind of information and data that we're going to be exploring every Thursday at noon over the course of the next 7 weeks. Daniel, do you want to say something about where we are going to be going forward?
Yes. So next week, we'll be looking at who homeschools. And we have a statistician from the U.S. Department of Education who will be reporting on the processes that the federal government uses to try to figure out who actually homeschools. And we also will have someone, Brian Ray from the National Homeschool Institute, who will be reporting on his assessments of the homeschool population as well. So that's where we're going next week. And I'll just say thank you again to the panelists. It was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciated having a chance to hear it. Thank you to the audience. And we will be here again, same time on this same link. And we hope everyone can join us next week.
If you're registered for the entire conference. Do tell your friends that before long we will be able to share this, but don't have them look immediately because it takes us a little time to do the closed captioning that's required to put this up online. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.